On Easter Sunday, 1998, Mark, Elena, and their 10-year-old son Daniel sat down to prepare dinner in their Chicago home. Hours later, the house was found silent, food half-cooked on the counter, shoes by the door, car still in the driveway. The family of 3 had vanished without a trace. For 15 years, the case froze in silence, rumors replacing answers. Then, during a renovation in 2013, workers pried open a hidden crawlspace beneath a nearby property. The stench and the evidence inside told investigators a story darker than anyone had imagined, and what police uncovered left Chicago stunned. Easter Sunday, 1998. The air in Chicago carried that early spring chill, sharp enough to sting your nose but softened by the promise of sunlight. Families in the neighborhood of Little Village bustled out of row houses in their best clothes, carrying baskets lined with pastel napkins. Church bells rang, echoing off brick walls, while kids raced each other down the sidewalks in patent shoes and scuffed sneakers. Inside a modest 2-story home sat the Delgados. Mark, 38, worked construction, broad-shouldered, always with a streak of dust on his jeans no matter how often he washed them. His wife, Elena, 34, taught Sunday school, a soft-spoken woman with eyes that rarely missed a detail. And Daniel, just 10, was that kind of boy who never seemed to sit still, always fiddling, tapping, tugging on a loose thread of his sweater. That morning they moved with the rhythm of routine. Elena whisked eggs in a chipped bowl, humming softly. Mark tied Daniel's tie, grumbling playfully about the knot being too small, only to be met with his son rolling his eyes, whispering, "What's up, Dad? I don't need baby ties anymore." Elena laughed, brushing flour from her apron onto his shoulder in a gesture half-loving, half-teasing. Neighbors waved from porches as the family stepped outside. Mr. Alvarez, shoveling away the last crust of snow, called out, "Off to Mass?" Mark raised a hand in reply. Daniel skipping ahead. 2 women leaning against a fence exchanged a glance, voices low. "That family's always so perfect," one muttered. The other smirked. "Yeah, wow, too perfect sometimes. Idle gossip, nothing sharp. Just the kind that floats behind people, unnoticed." At church, the Delgados took their usual pew near the back. Elena knelt, fingers brushing the worn beads of her rosary. Daniel yawned, head tilting against his father's arm. After the service, they lingered on the steps, talking with friends, smiling for a photo snapped by a neighbor's disposable camera. Ordinary moments, so unremarkable that no one thought they'd matter. By noon, they were back home. The car stayed parked neatly in the driveway. Elena began preparing food for the extended family gathering planned that evening. A ham rested on the counter, herbs scattered across the cutting board. Daniel sat at the table, peeling the foil off a chocolate egg, smearing his fingers sticky. Mark stepped outside to check the mail, flipping through envelopes as he adjusted his jacket. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, just a family moving through the soft hum of an Easter afternoon. But hours later, when relatives arrived for dinner, the house stood silent. Curtains half-drawn, lights still on, the ham untouched, a knife resting where Elena had left it. Jackets hung by the door, shoes neatly lined against the mat. The car was still in the driveway, and the Delgado family, Mark, Elena, and little Daniel, were gone. The first to notice something wrong was Elena's sister, Maria. She arrived at the house just after 5 p.m., balancing a casserole dish with oven mitts still warm from her kitchen. She expected the usual chaos. Daniel rushing to show off a new toy, Elena fussing over seating arrangements, Mark sneaking bites before dinner. Instead, she found silence. The front door wasn't locked. It creaked open with no resistance. Inside, the air carried the faint smell of herbs and ham that had never made it into the oven. The table was half set, 3 plates laid out, forks missing, napkins folded neatly but never placed. The casserole in Maria's hands grew heavier as unease pulled at her stomach. "Mark?" she called softly, her voice echoing in a way that felt wrong in a lived-in house. No answer. Upstairs, beds were made, clothes folded at the foot of the bed like someone had paused mid-task. Daniel's shoes were by his bed, socks crumpled beside them, as if he'd kicked them off before running downstairs. Nothing looked disturbed. No signs of a struggle. No broken glass. No overturned chairs. Everything was ordinary, and yet the silence made it unbearable. When more relatives arrived, voices filled the house with nervous questions. "Maybe they stepped out?" one aunt whispered, glancing at the untouched car in the driveway. Another muttered, "What's up with leaving food out like that?" Neighbors came over, peeking from porches, drawn by the unusual activity. Heads shook, voices dropped lower, the unease spreading like static. By evening, police were called, Officers moved through the rooms with steady steps, hands brushing door frames, eyes catching every detail. The unfinished meal, Elena's rosary resting on the counter, Mark's wallet on the dresser, cash still inside, Daniel's jacket hanging by the door. No one took anything. It was as if the family had simply stepped outside and evaporated. Searchlights soon cut through the night. Officers knocked on doors, asking neighbors what they'd seen. One woman swore she saw the family unloading groceries just hours earlier. Another insisted she heard voices in the backyard mid-afternoon. But none of it fit. The Delgado home became a stage frozen mid-scene, props in place, players gone. And as the hours stretched past midnight, panic replaced curiosity. Something had happened on Easter Sunday, but no one could explain how an entire family disappeared without leaving a single trace. By dawn, the Delgado home was no longer just a house. It was a command post. Squad cars lined the street, radios crackled with clipped voices, and yellow tape fluttered across the driveway. Officers moved in and out, carrying clipboards, dusting for prints, bagging items that seemed untouched only hours earlier. Detectives began with the neighbors. Mr. Alvarez repeated what he'd seen. Mark collecting the mail, Daniel hopping down the porch steps, Elena waving as she carried a basket. It was Easter, everything was normal, he insisted, voice steady, but eyes darting like he knew normal shouldn't vanish into thin air. Others weren't as certain. A woman down the block claimed she saw a dark van idling near the alley that afternoon. Another swore she heard a loud thud from the Delgado's yard, though she admitted it might have been fireworks. Each account overlapped and contradicted, tangling the timeline until nothing was clear. Search teams combed alleys, yards, and the nearby park. They pushed into basements, garages, and even dumpsters. Helicopters thumped overhead, their spotlights sweeping rooftops in wide arcs. Dogs pulled handlers down sidewalks, noses twitching, but each trail dissolved after only a few blocks. Inside the house, detectives cataloged everything. Elena's purse still sat on the counter, driver's license and cash inside. Mark's toolbox was in the garage, sockets scattered as if he'd been fixing something midday. Daniel's Game Boy hummed faintly on the couch, batteries dying as the screen flickered. Nothing pointed to escape. Nothing pointed to violence. Theories sprouted quickly. Abduction, one officer murmured, scribbling in his notebook. Another frowned, whispering back. No forced entry. No ransom note. What are we missing? In the corner, a detective rubbed his temples, muttering, "Families don't just walk out mid-meal." By the third day, flyers with the Delgados' faces wallpapered light poles and shop windows. News crews arrived, crowding the street, their cameras angled for grief. Relatives stood before microphones, pleading for information. Elena's sister clutched Daniel's school photo in trembling hands. "He's only 10, she cried. "Bring them home." But behind the tears, a darker current grew. At the local diner, voices carried, "Maybe they owed money." Another answered, "Yeah, wow, or maybe someone in that house had secrets." Every whisper carved new wounds for the family left behind. And yet, with all the manpower, all the theories, not a single concrete lead surfaced. It was as if the city itself had swallowed the Delgados whole, leaving behind only their quiet house on Easter Sunday, frozen in time, waiting for answers that never came. As days turned into weeks, the search lost its urgency, but the story of the Delgados began to grow. Chicago's papers ran the family's photos daily, headlines stamped in bold, "Family vanishes on Easter. No trace in Delgado case." Reporters swarmed the block, vans double-parked as journalists whispered outside the quiet home. The press framed it as a riddle, something sinister in the heart of a working-class neighborhood. On morning TV, anchors leaned forward across glossy desks, speaking with hushed fascination. A meal half prepared, shoes by the door, car in the driveway. How does a family of 3 simply disappear? Clips played of relatives begging through tears, Elena's mother clutching a rosary until her knuckles whitened. But beyond the cameras, gossip started to bite. At the diner, 2 men argued over coffee. "Wassop with Mark? He must have been into something," one muttered. The other shook his head, voice low. "Wow, you don't just kill your whole family mid-dinner." That's not him. Conversations like that spread, half-truths passed off as facts. Some neighbors whispered about debts, rumors of Mark owing money from construction jobs. Others speculated Elena had secrets, a private life she never shared. A few even said the family staged their own disappearance, walking away to start fresh somewhere else. Each theory took root, sprouting in the silence where facts should have been. The media leaned into the drama. One tabloid claimed police found hidden symbols in Daniel's room, implying cult activity. Another suggested the Delgados were targeted for witness protection. None of it was true, but it fed the city's hunger for answers. Meanwhile, detectives worked behind closed doors, frustration mounting. They chased tips that fizzled, sightings of the family in Indiana, a caller insisting he saw Daniel at a gas station in Michigan. Every lead ended the same, nothing. And the longer the case lingered unsolved, the more the narrative shifted away from truth. At church, whispers followed the family's surviving relatives. During Mass, one woman leaned toward another, her voice sharp even in reverence. Maybe they weren't as holy as they looked. The other sighed, crossing herself. God forgive you, but maybe you're right. That kind of talk stuck, cutting deeper than the silence. The Delgado home itself turned into a spectacle. Kids dared each other to run up the porch and peek through the windows, swearing they saw shadows move inside. Adults avoided walking past it after dusk. The half-drawn curtains, the frozen meal still in memory, made it feel haunted, not by ghosts, but by unanswered questions. By summer, the story no longer belonged just to the police or the relatives. It belonged to everyone. Strangers dissected the Delgados' lives like puzzle pieces, twisting every detail into a theory. In reality, no one knew anything. The truth was buried, smothered by rumor, and the more people talked, the further away it seemed to slip. And yet, even as the noise grew louder, the trail itself grew colder. By the first anniversary of the Delgado disappearance, the posters had yellowed, curling at the corners where they clung to lampposts. The street no longer buzzed with search teams or reporters, just the hum of traffic and the occasional passerby slowing to glance at the house that stood frozen in time. The Delgado home became a monument to absence. Curtains remained drawn. Grass grew wild along the walkway, weeds poking up through cracks in the driveway. Neighbors avoided looking too long at it, though kids on bikes slowed down, daring each other to touch the porch steps. They whispered about hearing Daniel's laughter when the wind rattled the siding, about seeing faces in the upstairs window. Inside the community, the family's name shifted from sympathy to myth. At the diner, voices were quieter now, but still sharp. 15 years, no trace, someone muttered. They didn't just vanish. Another sipped coffee, replying, "What's up with you?" People disappear all the time in this city. Theories were spoken casually, like weather. But for the relatives, every word landed like a blow. Detectives rotated in and out of the case. Some studied the file with fresh eyes, circling old notes, revisiting interviews. Others pushed it to the back of their desks when nothing new surfaced. Each new lead flickered briefly, sightings in another state, anonymous tips of shallow graves, before fizzling to nothing. The file grew thicker, but no closer to truth. The years eroded hope. Elena's sister stopped hosting Easter gatherings altogether. Mark's brother sold his house and moved across town, tired of strangers asking if he knew something. Even Daniel's classmates, once children themselves, grew into adults who spoke of him like a ghost they once knew. By the 10th year, the Delgados were no longer a news story, just a cautionary tale. A family that vanished midday, leaving their dinner half prepared. The silence was heavier than any headline, and still the house stood, silent, waiting. 15 years after Easter Sunday of 1998, the Delgado case lived only in cold files, stacked deep in a Chicago precinct. Detectives who once swore they'd solve it had retired or moved on, and the home on South Troy Street stood like a sealed tomb. But in 2013, chance broke the silence. It started with a renovation. A landlord in the same neighborhood began gutting an old property he'd recently purchased. The house had sat abandoned for years, its basement prone to flooding. Workers clearing debris stumbled on something they couldn't explain, a section of the floor that rang hollow when struck with a crowbar. Curious, they pried at it. Beneath cracked concrete lay a sealed crawl space, the air inside sour and heavy, stale with decades of stillness. Police were called immediately. Officers descended with flashlights, crouching into the hidden void. Inside, they found objects caked in dust and rot, personal items matching descriptions from the Delgado home. A child's shoe, the sole curled from age. A gold crucifix necklace like the one Elena was known to wear to Mass every Sunday. A men's watch engraved with MD. The discovery reignited the case overnight. The FBI was called in, evidence bags filled with decayed belongings. The street swarmed again with news vans, cameras pointed at the very neighborhood that had lived under whispers for a decade and a half. Neighbors stood on porches, murmuring. One older man muttered, "What's up with that house? We always knew something was off." A woman beside him shook her head. Wow, 15 years and only now they're checking basements? Detectives reopened every angle, piecing together how a family could vanish and end up tied to a forgotten storage under a home just blocks away. It was the first real break in years, and it promised either answers or something darker than anyone was ready for. The crawl space was sealed off for weeks, while forensic teams worked carefully, peeling back layers of earth and rust. Each day, evidence bags left the site. Bones, fabric, fragments of life that had been hidden in the dark for 15 years. Then came the confirmation. The skeletal remains of 3 individuals, consistent with Mark, Elena, and little Daniel Delgado. Forensic analysis revealed chilling details. The bones bore no signs of escape, only confinement. Clothing remnants matched what relatives said the family wore on Easter Sunday, 1998. Elena's crucifix was recovered beside her remains, chain twisted and corroded. Daniel's shoe sat a few feet away, eerily intact for its size. The city reeled. Chicagoans who had long spoken of the Delgados as legend now confronted the grim reality. They had never left the neighborhood at all. Their final hours had played out in silence, beneath the very streets where life moved forward above them. Relatives gathered outside the police station as detectives confirmed the findings. Elena's sister pressed the crucifix to her lips, eyes shut tight. Mark's brother whispered through clenched teeth, "They were here the whole time." Reporters captured every word, broadcasting the grief across the country. In Little Village, people spoke in hushed voices on sidewalks and stoops. "What's up with all those years?" one man muttered. "How does a whole family stay hidden like that?" Another answered, shaking his head slowly. "Wow, sometimes the city keeps secrets no one wants to find." The case was officially closed, but closure felt hollow. The discovery answered where the Delgados were, but not why, not how they ended up entombed beneath an ordinary house. For the families, for Chicago, the revelation was as heavy as the silence that preceded it. For 15 years, the truth of what happened to Mark, Elena, and young Daniel lay sealed beneath the city. And when it finally surfaced, it was darker than the mystery itself. If chilling cases like this keep you hooked, make sure to subscribe, drop a like, and turn on the bell, because the next story might be even more haunting.